Okay. Ken Rogoff, welcome to the Tailwind Podcast.
Hey, thanks, Andrew, for having me.
As a quick introduction, and I'm certainly going to leave some important things out, you're a longtime professor of economics at Harvard, as well as the former chief economist at the IMF. You're also a chess grandmaster. And with that overly brief introduction, why did you decide to write this book?
Well, I think above all, I had some things I wanted to say about people in my profession, policymakers, others tend to look at 20-year trends and think or even 5-year trends, think you can extrapolate them. And I think it's important to look more broadly at history to understand what comes next. So one example is China. Would China grow forever? Which many people thought. Another example was interest rates always be low. And would the dollar keep getting higher and higher and higher as it had been? So I've done a lot of professional work on this, but I decided to put it in a package where I could get those ideas out there, give a long historical sweep of how the dollar got there. And I think in the process, I learned a lot. I sort of came to the view, maybe more strongly than I had before, that we've been good, but we've also been lucky.
Why is it in America's interest for us to have the dominant currency in the world?
Well, there's sort of two broad classes of reasons. The obvious one is that if other countries are holding your currency, then you pay a lower interest rate. It's just like if 5 times as many people are willing to lend to you, you can bid down the interest rate. And that's quite a big number. So I want to say 0.5% to 1%, that might not sound like a big number. But when you owe $37 trillion, 1% a year is $370 billion. So I mean, it's really big money. I guess a second reason is that it has everything run through the United States. It's incredibly convenient in a million ways. A little bit like we were lucky to be born as English speakers. And that's really, used in a lot of business and trade, Chinese too, but English is really the best to have. And so if you sell stuff, if you buy stuff, we barely have to think about exchange rates compared to people in other countries. And I guess I should have given a third reason, is it gives us the power to use the dollar as a weapon. And we put in these things called financial sanctions, where we've done this to Russia, but we actually done it to like 20 countries before that, where we make it difficult for them to trade, to use the financial system. And I don't know how powerful it is, but it has some effect. And I think it's saved us from going into some wars and getting people drafted. So it's pretty powerful. I'd say a lot of countries don't like that. They resent that the most of anything about the dollar.
So the term network effects appeared in the book, and that's a term I encounter often in the world of tech and investing. Yeah. And so you say that currencies have network effects, and that's one of the reasons why it's so difficult for other currencies to come and sort of dethrone the dollar. So how do currencies benefit from network effects?
Well, a really simple example is you just want to trade, say, South African rand and Polish zlotys. Actually, there are not many buyers or sellers of those things, but it's really convenient to take your African rand, buy dollars, very low cost, and then take the dollars and buy zlotys. So there are a lot of examples. That's the most striking one of network effects. Oh, also in trade, I can just compare the prices from different countries. Financial instruments, if I lend in dollars, then it's easier to borrow in dollars because the currencies match. The thing is, network effects aren't the be-all and end-all that some Americans think they are. I mean, the Europeans, they're not using the dollar. They used to be the center of the dollar bloc till about 50 years ago, and they've broken off. That's 20% of, the global finance in some ways broken off. And China could break off. Why do they do that if there's these great network effects? Because they don't like us bossing them around and telling them what to do and collecting all this information. So yes, they're network effects, but for the same reason, you only have just one credit card company or, just one of things. There's maybe natural to have a few to sort of meet these other needs that countries have.
Yeah, that's a great segue. So, over the last, let's say, 500 years, I think the dominant currency has been supplanted around 4 or 5 times, right?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, there was Spain in the 1500s, and they're famous. I don't know how many of your listeners know about the invincible Spanish Armada. They were going to invade England, take over England. It fell short because of a storm, but they borrowed a ton of money to finance the Invincible Armada. Hadn't occurred to them they might not win, and that eventually ended Spain's dominance. Then the Netherlands came, and they did really well because they were very innovative. People had been using coins. Yeah, that's what everybody had used. And the Dutch sort of really started using not quite paper currency, but banknotes, where they write something that the Bank of Amsterdam promises to pay 1,000 florins to Andrew. And you could take that and bring that to other places. So that was a big innovation. They ruled. Then they ran into losing wars. And after the Napoleonic Wars, it was the UK. And after World War II, it was the US. But I should say there have been periods where multiple currencies were circulating. So the Spanish peseta, even though Spain was no longer so dominant, they coined really good currency. Even 100 years after it was no longer dominant, people trusted the peseta more than anything else. They had a lot of silver. The dollar and the pound cohabited the dominant currency between the wars. And I sort of think that's likely what's going to happen over the next 20 years, where the dollar will stay on top, but not necessarily as totally dominant as it is now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I do think it's worth noting that those countries are still around. They're still doing well, maybe not thriving to the level that they were sort of at their peaks. So I guess with that, so how disastrous, if at all, do you think it would be for the United States if the dollar was not as dominant or sort of lost its position as the dominant currency in the world?
Well, it sort of depends on why. So at one time, it seemed China was just going to do better, and better and better. And that didn't go as fast and may never go as far as it would. So if China takes over by being an industrial giant, by bringing a lot to the world, that's one thing. It's another thing if the US undermines the independence of its central bank and has a lot of inflation. That's not really good for anybody. Unfortunately, I think near term, that's the bigger issue, that our debt is somewhat out of control. Populists on both the left and the right have kind of forgotten why we have an independent central bank, what it works like when we don't. And so I worry, based on research, based on watching what's going on, that we're headed for a period of unrest like that.
So I was going to ask this later, but I since you brought it up, the topic of the importance of central bank independence is a reoccurring theme throughout the book. So I guess I'm just would be interested to hear you explain sort of how you've arrived at that view, that central bank independence is so important.
Well, I'm a little bit talking my book because I wrote the first paper on central bank independence. It's my most famous paper. It's a relatively recent innovation. Actually, when I wrote my paper, there were only a couple independent central banks in the world. Now, everybody claims to be independent. I mean, obviously, the Russian central bank is not as independent as the Federal Reserve. And actually, the European Central Bank is a lot more independent than the Federal Reserve. It has constitutional protection, which the Fed doesn't have. So why is it important? Well, basically, politicians are under a lot of pressure to deliver tomorrow. And that often means getting interest rates down right away. And you're hearing the president constantly say, I want the interest rate to be 1%. Too late, Powell should be cutting interest rates. The interest rates are now 4.25 to 5. That's the short-term interest rate. And he wants them to cut it to 1. He could be right, but probably if Powell did that and he talked the Fed into doing it, it would stimulate the economy just too much. And we'd end up getting inflation. And what would happen is even if they kept the short rates down there, the long rates aren't going to stay down there. The inflation's akin to default. It's a partial default on you're getting paid in debased dollars. Creditors have to get paid for that. So if you're creating inflation expectations, you're going to push up long rates. So, he could be right that interest rates could come down without causing inflation. He's surely not right that it could come down that much, but that sort of captures it. My first job out of graduate school, I worked for Bill Miller, who was a Fed chair of The World Is Forgotten. And he wanted to be in the paper every day. He wanted them to write something nice about him. And back then, the press didn't understand central bank independence. So he's been saying, we're going to cut the rates. We're going to cut the rates. And he couldn't figure out why all the interest rates were going up and up. And eventually they got rid of him.
In the book, you go through a number of examples of countries where basically once the central bank lost its independence, typically some sort of economic troubles followed.
Yeah, I mean, it's not one for one. China's doing okay, and their central bank is by no means independent. It's quite subservient. Japan didn't have an independent central bank till a few decades ago. In fact, most countries didn't. But the thing is, we had this shift to unbacked currency that really only took full root in 1971. Mm-hmm. We went off gold for individuals. Franklin Roosevelt abrogated the gold clause. He wouldn't honor it. And as an individual, it was actually for a while illegal to hold gold. But then it wasn't backed. It used to be your dollar was convertible to gold. But if you're a country, that was true until 1971, at least on paper. We were honoring it. And then Nixon said, no, we're not going to do that anymore. And the 70s was an awful period. I don't know how much your listeners have read about it, where we had the U.S. inflation went up to 14%, but for a long time, it was really high. They couldn't figure out how to bring it down. And it was really central bank independence that brought it down. The central banks, it was pretty obvious what to do. You don't need to take an advanced economics course to understand if you print and print and print money, you're going to get inflation. But you put yourself as a politician where these people want this and other people want that, and you're trying to please everyone. It's very tempting to try to hold interest rates down, end up with these, doing it for too long, stimulating the economy too much and having high inflation.
Yeah. So a major part of your book, a major focus of it is talking about the potential threats to the US dollar. And let's start with China's renminbi. So to set the stage there, China's economy grew at very high rates for decades. As you write in the book, I think kind of around 2010, people thought that those high growth rates would continue. But in the 2010s, I think 2014 specifically, you started warning that China's growth rate would fall significantly in the coming decade. What were you seeing or maybe paying attention to that others weren't?
Well, they have the housing bubble of all housing bubbles. I mean, where we had our prices go up by a factor of 2, 100% in a lot of cities. In China, we're talking by 500%, even in some cities, 1,000%. And they were showing various signs of that running into stress. Other people said, well, that's nothing to worry about. They're centrally planned. They can't have a financial crisis. But to make a long story short, I worried about it. I looked at it. I wrote about it. And they've ran into massive trouble. They're still digging their way out of it. When I first was writing about this, everybody dismissed it, the people who worked on it. But I think now the only debate's about, is it going to last 5 years or is it going to last 10 years, the housing problems that they have.
What is the Lewis transition, and how did China combat that phenomenon, which typically spells trouble for developing economies?
Boy, that's a great question. So Arthur Lewis wrote about how in a lot of developing economies, the way they get growth is the people who are working on the farms gradually come into the cities into the more efficient part of the economy. Let's remember in the United States, if you went back to, 1800, we were all farmers. And we had the Industrial Revolution. We started working the cities. There were big gains. And that happens at hyper speed in a fast developing economy because everything's already been invented. And so it's just a matter of getting people to work. The trouble is that if you pack everyone into the city too much, too fast, it just can't take it. There's all kinds of social problems. And I don't know, I'm sure you've, been to Mumbai and Sao Paulo and Cairo, some of these cities, which actually, if you'd gone back, longer ago, didn't seem nearly as packed as they are now. And China looked at that and they said, it's not happening here. We're going to let people move to the cities, but they're going to need special passes, special visas to be able to do that. But we're going to make them really happy by building and building and building great railroads, great buildings, great roads. And China did this to an extent we've never seen in history. I think Larry Summers had some fact, which I don't know if it's exactly true, but it's approximately true, that they put down more cement over 3 years, starting in 2010, than we put down in the history of our country. So they built these beautiful cities, but nobody wanted to live there, was still the problem. It wasn't a farm, a lot better than the farm, but it's kind of boring. And young people didn't want to stay. There were no exciting careers. There was no social life. And so it didn't work as well as they thought. And they built up all these cities, sort of not the biggest cities, but middle-sized, which in China is still a lot of people, built up these middle-sized cities that are not doing well. The houses aren't, worth what anyone paid for them. A lot of buildings are empty. And they tried to cover this up for a long time, but eventually they couldn't.
It's so part of the reason that optimists kind of around 2010 thought China would continue to grow at really high rates was because they had combated that phenomenon. They had sort of it seemingly pulled off this miracle of navigating people from the sort of more rural areas moving to the cities. But in reality, rents were not being collected to the same effect that people had thought. So in 2020, you wrote a paper saying that the construction sector would encounter diminishing returns. And how have those struggles in construction and real estate related to sort of China's slowing growth rate?
Well, I think it's at the center of them because real estate's counting infrastructure. So the building, and we're counting the indirect things, furniture, the electricity that goes into it and everything. It's about a third of the economy. I mean, it's huge. And you can't easily move those people. You see people writing about their green cars, their solar panels. They have a fantastic electric car industry, but that it employs very few people. They're very automated factories. So there's very, very high youth unemployment. So high, they don't publish the number anymore. It was too embarrassing to the party. They did have a miracle. I mean, what China did's amazing. They've done a lot of amazing things, but I think people overstated it. They were most Americans and most Westerners only went to these handful of big cities. You may have traveled to a few more, but I think most people have not. Have you been to other Chinese cities, I should ask, outside
Yeah, I've been to the main ones. I've been to Beijing, Shanghai, and Hong Kong. I went to 2 other tier 2 cities, but I took the train everywhere. And I remember on the train, in America, when you're flying over sort of more rural areas, you see plots of sort of crops and farmland, and then you see maybe one house kind of on each plot. But in China, it was just crops as far as you could see, and then every now and then there'd be a 30-story apartment building. Just kind of instead of everyone living kind of in their own individual houses on these plots, it's like everyone would sort of live in this one really tall building and then wake up and go sort of farm and then come back to that tall building. And I think when I was there, it was right before the Evergrande issues started to sort of blow up.
Real estate bankruptcy.
Yeah. But it was surreal to see that approach of everyone we're going to build these apartment buildings for everyone in more rural areas rather than them kind of having their own house on individual plots. And so it's a different approach. So I guess with all of that as backdrop, just sort of about China's economy, how much of a threat do you think the renminbi is to the dollar, either to supplant it or just to steal significant market share?
They're going to steal significant market share. And it's easy to do because they are a big market share of the dollar. The renminbi has been pegged to the dollar for a long time and it's loosened it. But it really, Asia, by some measures, is half the dollar bloc. Remember, we lost Europe. Europe's not there. I forgot to finish that thought, but when we went off the gold standard, Europe had been the dollar bloc. The dollar bloc was Europe, Canada, and Japan, basically Australia. Most of the world was not in it because they weren't globalized. We lost that. And I think as we struggle with our problems, and also as we impose so many sanctions, we're going to lose part of Asia. So what does that mean? It means, going back to you asked, what's great about the dollar? We'll pay higher interest rates. I mean, the dollar may still be the biggest, but losing a chunk of Asia is big. Asia is super important part of the global economy, part of dollar's business. And also our ability to impose sanctions is going to go down because they're developing their own networks, their own ways of doing financial transactions. The new technologies I'm sure you know lots about, give lots of new ways to do this. And so suddenly our sanctions, which already work but not great, they're not going to work at all.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned the euro there, which has stolen market share from the dollar. How much do you consider it a potential threat to not just continue to steal market share, but to supplant the dollar?
I mean, as a threat to supplant the dollar, it's non-existent. I mean, for one thing, you can't be the dominant currency without a serious military. Mm-hmm. And Europe, I think, optimistically might be able to defend itself with some help. It's military, it spends money, but actually has very little capacity. So that's non-existent. However, it could take a bigger share. Actually, if you did global reserves, that's what the central banks hold. It's not the only measure, it's not perfect, but I think it's indicative. Before Europe had its debt crisis in 2010, 2012, when the euro almost broke up, they were over 25% of global reserves. And they fell quite a bit. I mean, it's below 20 now. They could build that up. They could go further because there are countries in Latin America that trade more with Europe than with the United States. There are a lot of countries in Africa that do that, some countries in Asia. And I think you could see the euro move there. So I can imagine where they had fallen to, say, 20%, they'll go to 30%. Kick in China gradually rising to 10 or 20, even 30%. You can see how that eats into our market share.
Yeah. I want to go through sort of like a lightning round of other potential threats to the dollar. And to echo your point from earlier, the concern for Americans should basically be that we've enjoyed lower interest rates because our currency is the dominant one in the world. So we get lower rates on home loans and car loans, and our businesses can borrow at lower rates because a lot of the world is buying our treasuries. So as these threats steal market share, potentially supplant the dollar, we're all going to be paying higher rates.
And I might add quickly, and we'll really feel it when there's a crisis, when we always go out and borrow way more than anybody else and don't seem to pay a price for it. Maybe not next time.
So one you mentioned in the book is a global currency. For instance, the IMF's SDR, or special drawing right, which is something that I think was an idea created in 1969.
The euro has trouble as a currency because the countries can't agree on anything. Mm-hmm. Basically, the IMF issuing a currency means China, the US, everybody using it has to agree on stuff. It was never an idea. It's been used as a thin veneer to try to make non-transparent transfers, but it's just never going to happen.
Right. Cryptocurrencies such as Bitcoin, and I want to separate out stablecoins, which we can come to next.
Well, Bitcoin has taken market share from the dollar here and now. And it's not so much in the legal economy, and I use legal to capture what governments are trying to control, but in the underground economy, that doesn't have to be drugs, human trafficking. It's mostly avoiding taxes. And so in emerging markets, it's just huge. And I think a lot of wealthy individuals, even not so wealthy individuals in emerging markets, they use Bitcoin for transactions, but also they view as a store of value. Maybe the US will rat them out, if they're holding dollar assets in the United States, and Bitcoin won't. So there's fundamental value there. And the dollar had some of that market. The Bitcoin already competes there.
How could the government sort of tip the scales to prevent Bitcoin or something like a cryptocurrency from supplanting the dollar?
Well, the cryptocurrency is not a natural thing to supplant the dollar. Well, you said stablecoins later. It's so volatile. It's not a store of value. It's not easy to do transactions. My God, I could do a transaction in Bitcoin where I thought I was paying one price, and 10 minutes later, it turns out to be a completely different price. So it's not really a threat as a substitute for the dollar. It's very innovative, but it's not that.
So how about stablecoins then?
I see stablecoins as the potential killer app for cryptocurrencies.
Yeah.
And how it evolves is unclear. We just had this Genius Act. I don't know how aptly named it was, but Trump always has great names, which is trying to legitimize stablecoins by providing some rules, a regulatory framework. It's a good idea. The basic idea is good. But a lot remains to be determined. For one thing, stablecoins really are cryptocurrencies. They're tokenized claims on these dollars, and they don't remotely meet anti-money laundering standards. Most of them. I want to be careful not to tar them all with the same brush, but the large majority of them don't meet anti-money laundering standards. It's hard to keep track. If I want to audit you, it's hard. A lot of the low costs for them have to do with not having to follow consumer protection rules and regulations. But, to make a long story short, the US has decided to go all in on stablecoins and conquer the world that way. Europe and China are reluctant to do that because they're afraid that precisely because they're still cryptocurrencies, they won't be able to regulate and collect taxes in their own countries. And the US needs to think about that too.
Can you correct me if I'm wrong about this? Because I've seen different things that stablecoins are really a tailwind for the dollar because companies offering stablecoins have to peg their coin to the dollar, and they do so by buying treasuries. So as more people increase demand for stablecoins, does that not mean increased demand for treasuries and therefore the dollar?
Oh, it absolutely does. So dollar stablecoins are a way to proselytize the dollar, to push the dollar around the globe. Some of the treasuries that people are going to hold in stable coins, a good chunk of them are probably coming out of bank deposits. And that is something regulators in most countries have been very leery about because stable coins are holding treasuries and banks with some of their money are making loans to, hardware stores or car loans and this and that. So banks have two sides to their balance sheet. We're taking away one side, but not replacing the other. I think that's a concern. Now, some of the money is going to come from emerging markets, maybe even come from China. That definitely is adding money. So it definitely does bring that benefit. On the other hand, these other countries may push back in a lot of ways.
Last potential threat, central bank digital currencies, which are essentially digital cash that's sort of issued and backed by a country's central bank. How much of a threat to the dollar are those types of currencies?
Well, the European Central Bank is all in on the digital central bank currency. And initially, they're going to cap the size you can hold. And I should say a retail one that you and I can hold. Initially, they're going to cap the amount at a few €1,000, but eventually they might not. And that they absolutely intend eventually to be used for trade. It's a way to get around the dollar financial system. China initially was ahead on that. They're lagging a little now, but they have the same idea. So Europe and China are going to use that. Now, we can do that too. President Trump, for the moment, has forbid it. He's told the Federal Reserve not to work on it. But the stable coins are sort of what we're doing. So, it's one of those things where there is a concern we'll be asleep and suddenly the euro stable coins just so far ahead of us, or a Singapore dollar has gotten so far ahead of us, it's hard to catch up. I don't think we're anywhere near that point yet. But by forbidding the central bank to work on it, yeah, it helps stable coins, but it might help China and Europe too.
So of all the threats we've talked about today, and you mentioned in the book, which one would you consider to be the most threatening to the dollar? And I think if you also want to choose the option of we are sort of our own worst enemy, that's an option too.
Oh, absolutely. We are our own worst enemy. So we have an unsustainable debt that both parties contribute to. And I would liken it to sort of a volcano. You don't know when it's going to explode, but that doesn't mean it never will. It could take a long time. But I think eventually we'll have some kind of debt crisis. Not that we have to, but the reason I think we will is there's no voter support for any kind of reining things in. Now, the crisis could be inflation. The crisis could be what we call financial repression, where the central bank buys up tons and tons of debt, even 3 times what it's done in the past, where we force banks, insurance companies, pension funds to hold debt. It could come in the form of partial default to foreigners. We have no idea. Oh, and of course, we could rein in our spending. But I suspect that interest rates will force our hand at some day to make some decisions. Our political system's paralyzed. So I think we're going to, just as the financial crisis kind of had to happen to get us to regulate the financial sector, I think we're going to need a debt crisis to get us to have a more sensible approach to fiscal policy.
The dollar recently has declined about 10% in value. Should we be freaking out about this in the context of the overall debt crisis you just mentioned?
Not at all. I mean, the dollar was overvalued. I think it's very hard to predict exchange rates, but when it's way out of line, and the dollar had gotten just very high when you take into account what you can buy in the United States with $100 versus what you can buy in other countries, it gotten way out of line. It was, I think, if Harris had won, it'd be going down. The yen is really low by the same token. I don't think Japan's got the most wonderful new government in the world, but I think the yen's going to go up. So no, I don't think that's really the core of the story. The dollar's been high, the dollar's been low. We've been at the center of the global financial system all the time. There are people who try to connect the two things, but I think they're different.
Have there been times in the last few decades where the dollar has dropped significantly?
Oh, goodness. So the 2 previous times where it's really, really tanked have been the 2 times when it was really high. 1985, when we started an orchestrated plan to bring it down, but it went way further than we'd intended. And that was under Ronald Reagan. And then in 2002, under George W. Bush, it got very high. I think it fell by as much as 40% over the next couple of years. So it's fallen 10%, but that's nothing compared to how overvalued it is. I think it could potentially fall a lot more.
Oh, wow. So we talked about some of the benefits of being the country with the dominant currency in the world. What are some of the costs that are associated with it?
Well, first, I'll say what I said in my book, which I think is correct. And then I'll say what Trump's economists say, which I think has a grain of truth, but it's not so important. First and foremost, you have to maintain a military. You have to be one of the couple major geopolitical powers. We can go all those examples we looked at. That's expensive. And if you rein it in, it's going to matter. So it matters in some subtle ways. First of all, places where we're providing the safety net for that country, like Japan, they're going to use the dollar. They know where their bread is buttered and which side their bread is buttered. They're going to use the dollar. But also, there are all kinds of international negotiations where the U.S., we have a big economy, but we also rule in military, where we get a lot of say. Trump does this very crudely, but previous presidents were doing the same thing, where we force the system to say go through the United States to favor United States banks. Another cost is that usually there's a flight to safety when there's a crisis, unless the crisis starts in the United States, which might have happened, or could happen. But if it starts somewhere, it's flight to safety. That makes the dollar go up. And the dollar going up actually makes what we hold abroad worth less. All our investments in Germany and England and Japan in dollars are worth less because they're in foreign currency, and all the foreigners are worth more. So the Trump administration has added to this that because everyone loves the dollar, and I think what they really mean are U.S. assets in general, and U.S. assets have been amazing, it has bid up the dollar, and that's taken away our manufacturing base. That's their line. And there's like a grain of truth to that, but it's not just about the fact the dollar's the so-called reserve currency, the central currency. It's our tech sectors killed it. If the euro had been the dominant currency for some reason, and our tech sector had done what it's done, the dollar would have gone up. I mean, the exchange rate would have appreciated enormously. But I think the military is the single biggest cost. If you allow it to fall too much, you will feel it in how much people use the dollar. And also it lets us make the rules of the game.
You had a chart in the book, which I think it was military expenditures as a percentage of GDP has dropped from a sort of peak in the middle of the 20th century, which was obviously right after two world wars. I think at its peak, it was 16%, and it's dropped to 3.5%. My takeaway from that was that we have, to some degree, we've replaced part of our budget of spending on military with just higher debt payments or higher interest payments on our debt. So spending less in the military has sort of enabled us to pay higher interest on our debt. Are those two things related? I guess what was the point of?
We thought there was this fantastic peace dividend when the Cold War ended. At the end of the Cold War, we spent about 7% of our GDP on defense, down from the peak you mentioned, but still, I think it was 6.8%. And then it fell by some measures, it's like about 3% now. We thought we didn't need it. And now suddenly we're worried about China blockading Taiwan. We're worried, obviously, Russia, Ukraine. Who knows what's next in the Middle East? And we probably need to spend more. So I think the rest of the world's spending much more on military. I put that chart in the context of giving one of the major reasons that there's push up on interest rates. There's a lot of reasons, but we have more debt, populism, but also there's a lot of pressures around the world to build up the military. So what you say about, it allowed us to spend more stuff on other things. Where I think it sort of connects with debt is people, and I'd say particularly progressives, said there'll just never be a war again. We don't need to have any military. There'd sort of been this detente in the Congress that it used to be till now that when the Republicans, who typically wanted an increase in military, the Democrats would go along and say, well, you can spend more, but you've got to spend at least the same amount on social programs. In fact, Germany just did that when they did an increase in the military. So it's allowed us to just, it's just not a real problem. Why are we doing this? I know a lot of money is spent very inefficiently in the military, but I suspect we're pushing the Europeans to spend 5% of GDP. I think we're going to end up doing the same.
We've come up on time, Ken. One last question for you. I mentioned earlier that you were a professional chess player. I think you dropped out of school when you were 13 to play chess around the world and ultimately became a grandmaster. 16. Did you become a grandmaster and then go to college?
I came close, but no, I went to college and fortunately kept improving and playing in the summers. And I only made the grandmaster title actually just as I was in a summer, just as I was graduating college. I think I wouldn't have gone to graduate school if I hadn't become a grandmaster. I was determined. I'd come so close. I think I was the highest ranked player in the world who wasn't a grandmaster because I hadn't played enough tournaments. But I took away a lot from chess into economics. And actually in the book, I try to bring chess in a little bit, just a little insights it's given me.
You weave in a lot of personal anecdotes throughout the book, and that was going to be my question. How did your experiences as a chess player inform some of your views about global economics?
Well, for one thing, I saw a lot of things. First of all, I led a somewhat bohemian life as a chess player. I started making a lot of money at some point, but you see things, So, for example, I had an understanding of how cash was used around the world that I think I would dare say a lot of my professor colleagues have no idea, by comparison, what goes on. I saw Eastern Europe and Russia. They weren't doing very well. And when I went to Yale, my professors were telling us Russia was going to catch up to the United States. That was in Samuelson's textbook. That's what everyone thought. And I was thinking, not where I saw it. Sure didn't look like that. And it certainly comes into some of my writing. My probably most important paper on why you should have an independent central bank actually uses game theory, which is very mathematical. I'm good at math, but not great. But a lot of the results are very intuitive to me. You could arrive at them through a lot of math, but I can get them intuitively. And I use that in doing this paper on central banking, why is it a game theory thing? Because there's a strategic interaction between the public, the president and the government and the central bank, and how does that play out?
Ken Rogoff, author of Our Dollar, Your Problem. Thank you very much for coming on the podcast.
Thank you for having me, Andrew.